Emma had just started working as a babysitter for the Nelson family. They lived in a large, quiet house on the outskirts of town. The house was old, with tall trees surrounding it. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet, but Emma didn't mind. It was an easy job. The kids, Lucas and Ella, were already asleep upstairs, so all she had to do was relax until Mr. and Mrs. Nelson came home. Before leaving, Mrs. Nelson smiled warmly at Emma. "Thank you so much for watching the kids tonight. We will be back late, so feel free to watch TV or help yourself to some snacks." Emma nodded and smiled back. "No problem, Mrs. Nelson. Have a great night." As they left, the house felt a little too big and empty. Emma could hear the sound of their car starting up and driving away into the night. Now, it was just her, Lucas, Ella, and the quiet house. She sat down on the couch and turned on the TV. It was going to be an easy night, or so she thought. After about an hour, Emma started to get bored. She flipped through the channels, but nothing caught her interest. It was too quiet, even with the TV on. Then, the house phone rang. Emma jumped a little at the sudden noise. Who could be calling? She wondered. It was late, and she didn't know anyone who would call this house. She picked up the phone. "Hello." For a few seconds, there was silence on the other end. Then, a deep voice spoke, slow and cold. "Have you checked the children?" Emma froze. Her heart skipped a beat. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shaking slightly. But there was no answer. The line went dead. Emma stared at the phone in confusion. "Weird," she muttered, trying to shake off the strange feeling growing in her chest. It was probably just a prank call. Nothing to worry about. She placed the phone back on the table and tried to focus on the TV again. But her mind kept drifting back to that voice. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. Emma stared at it, her pulse quickening. Was it the same person? She picked it up slowly. "Hello." The same deep voice answered. "Have you checked the children?" Emma's hands started to shake. She slammed the phone down this time, her breathing quick and shallow. "Who is this?" she whispered to herself. This was no ordinary prank. Something felt wrong. Her eyes darted toward the staircase that led to Lucas and Ella's room. They were asleep. They had to be. She hadn't heard a sound. From upstairs, her phone buzzed with a message from her friend, Sarah. Emma quickly grabbed it, her hands trembling slightly. She texted Sarah, "In babysitting, but I keep getting these creepy calls. It's freaking me out. Should I check on the kids?" A moment later, Sarah replied, "Maybe it's just a prank, but yeah, check the kids to be safe." Emma stood up, staring at the dark staircase. The house felt colder now, and shadows danced in the corners of the room. She slowly made her way toward the stairs, her heart pounding louder with each step. The stairs creaked under Emma's feet. As she climbed them, she reached the top and paused, listening for any sound. From the children's room, everything was silent. She tiptoed down the hallway toward Lucas and Ella's door, her heart racing. She gently opened the door and peeked inside. Lucas and Ella were both sound asleep, their small faces calm and peaceful. Emma let out a long breath of relief. She was just being paranoid. The kids were fine. Nothing was wrong. It was just some weirdo on the phone. She closed the door softly and walked back downstairs, trying to shake off the lingering feeling of unease. But before she reached the bottom of the stairs, The phone rang again. Emma's body froze. She didn't want to answer the phone, but she had to. Her hands were trembling. As she picked up the receiver, "Hello," she whispered, her voice barely audible. This time, the voice was quieter, more menacing, and closer than you think. Emma's blood ran cold. She slammed the phone down and backed away from it. Her breathing was fast, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked around the room, suddenly feeling like she wasn't alone. Every shadow seemed darker, every creak of the house louder. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911. Her fingers were shaking so much that she almost dropped the phone. 911. "What's your emergency?" A calm voice answered. "I am babysitting, and someone keeps calling me. He is asking about the children. I think someone is watching me," Emma said, her voice trembling. "Stay calm. We will trace the call and send an officer to your location. Is anyone else in the house with you?" "No, it is just me and the kids. I haven't seen anyone." "Lock the doors and stay where you are. Help is on the way." Emma hung up the phone and rushed to lock the front door. She checked the windows too, making sure they were all secure. The house felt quiet again, but this time it was an eerie silence. Every second felt like an hour as she waited for the police to arrive. Emma sat on the couch, staring at the phone. It hadn't rung again, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The minutes dragged on, and every little sound made her jump. She looked at her phone. No messages from Sarah. She considered calling her, but what could she say? That she was scared out of her mind and didn't know what to do. Suddenly, there was a noise outside. It sounded like footsteps on the porch. Emma froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked toward the front door. Had the police arrived? Or was it someone else? She slowly stood up and walked toward the door, her hands shaking. She listened carefully. The footsteps stopped. She peered through the small window next to the door, but saw nothing. Then, the phone rang again. Emma's whole body tensed as the phone rang. She didn't want to answer it, but she couldn't ignore it either. She picked it up, her hand trembling. "Hello," she whispered, barely able to speak. The voice on the other end was soft, but chilling. "I am inside the house." Emma dropped the phone and backed away, her breathing fast and shallow. She looked around wildly, but the house was still. The kids, she had to check on the kids again. She bolted up the stairs, her feet barely touching the steps. Her heart was racing as she reached Lucas and Ella's room. She pushed open the door and rushed to the beds. Both kids were still asleep. Emma let out a shaky breath. They were safe, but she wasn't. Suddenly, she heard a noise behind her, a creak. She spun around, her eyes wide. The hallway outside the room was empty, but the air felt heavy, like someone was watching her. She grabbed a nearby lamp, holding it tightly in her hands. As she slowly backed toward the door, she had to get out of the house. But the front door was locked, and someone was out there, or worse, inside with her. Emma stood frozen at the top of the stairs, her eyes darting around the dark hallway. She couldn't see anyone, but she could feel something. Someone close. Her heart was pounding so hard. She thought it might burst out of her chest. Suddenly, she saw it. A shadow. It was faint, but unmistakable, moving slowly along the wall. At the bottom of the stairs, Emma's breath caught in her throat. The shadow was coming from inside the house. She had to move, had to hide. But where? She couldn't leave the kids. She couldn't leave them alone with whatever that thing was. Emma quickly but quietly ran back into Lucas and Ella's room. She locked the door behind her, her hands shaking so badly that she could barely turn the lock. She needed to protect them. But how? She grabbed her phone again and called the police. "Please, hurry," she whispered into the phone. "He's in the house. He's in the house. The officers are on their way. Stay calm, stay hidden," the operator said, her voice steady. But it did little to calm Emma's racing heart. Emma backed away from the door, holding the lamp tightly. The room was quiet, but she knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, loud and fast. She glanced at the kids. They were still asleep, unaware of the danger lurking just outside. Suddenly, there was a noise, a soft creak. It came from the hallway. Emma froze, listening. Another creak, closer this time. Someone was outside the door. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched the doorknob slowly turn. The lock held, but whoever was on the other side was trying to get in. Emma's hands were shaking as she tightened her grip on the lamp. She had to protect the kids. She had to stop whoever it was. The doorknob rattled again, more forcefully this time. Emma stood frozen, her eyes locked on the door. Her heart raced, her breathing shallow. She could feel the cold sweat on her skin as the reality of the situation sank in. Whoever was outside wanted to come in. Suddenly, the rattling stopped. There was silence, a heavy silence that filled the room. Emma didn't move, too afraid to make a sound. Was he still there, or had he gone? She slowly took a step back, her eyes darting between the door and the sleeping children. She had to think fast. The windows were too high to climb out of, and she couldn't leave the kids. Her mind raced with possibilities, but each one ended in fear. Then, she heard it, a soft, almost inaudible scratching at the door. Whoever was out there wasn't gone. He was waiting. Emma's grip on the lamp tightened. She stood her ground, ready to swing at the intruder. If they broke through the door, every second felt like an eternity. Suddenly, the door shook violently as the intruder banged against it, trying to force it open. The children stirred in their beds, but they didn't wake. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as the door creaked under the force of the intruder's attack. How much longer would the lock hold? She had to do something. Emma backed away from the door, her mind racing. She needed a plan, and fast. She glanced around the room, searching for something, anything that could help. Her eyes landed on the dresser near the window. It was heavy, but maybe she could block the door with it. She quickly but quietly moved toward the dresser, her hands trembling as she pushed against it. The wooden piece groaned under the weight, but Emma didn't stop. With all her strength, she slid it across the floor and wedged it against the door. The banging outside grew louder, more violent. The intruder was desperate to get in. Emma backed away, her back against the wall, clutching the lamp like a weapon. She stared at the door, waiting, her breath shallow and quick. If he broke through the door, she would have to fight. She had no other choice. The banging continued, but the dresser held firm. Emma could hear the intruder grunting, frustrated, on the other side. Then, without warning, the banging stopped. There was silence again. For a moment, Emma dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, he had given up. But then she heard it, the sound of footsteps retreating down the hallway. Emma's relief was short-lived. The intruder hadn't left. He was still in the house, and now he was trying something else. She could hear him, moving around downstairs, opening doors, searching for another way to get to her. The sound of drawers being opened and furniture being moved echoed through the house. He was looking for something. But what? Emma's mind raced. What was he planning? Would he try to climb through a window? Or find a way to break the lock on the front door? Her phone buzzed in her hand. She quickly glanced at it. A text from the police. Officers are nearby. Stay hidden. Emma's heart pounded, with a mix of relief and fear. The police were close, but would they get there in time? She could hear the intruder's footsteps, moving toward the kitchen. There was a loud crash, followed by silence. Emma's heart raced. What was he doing now? Suddenly, she realized what he was after. The back door. Emma's stomach dropped. The back door. She had forgotten to lock it. Her mind raced. If he found the back door unlocked, he could get in easily. And then, there would be nothing between him and her. And worse, the children. She couldn't let that happen. Quietly, Emma stood up, her legs shaking. She tiptoed toward the door, careful not to make a sound. The dresser blocked the door, but she could still hear every movement outside. The intruder was in the kitchen now, and the back door was just a few steps away. She had to move fast, but she couldn't leave the children alone in the room. What if he got to them before she did? Emma's heart pounded as she made a split-second decision. She ran back to the window and peered out. The backyard was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the moon. If she could get the kids out through the window, they could escape and run to the neighbors for help. It was risky, but it might be their only chance. Quickly, Emma went to Lucas' bed and gently shook him awake. "Lucas, wake up," she whispered urgently. The boy stirred, blinking sleepily. "What's happening?" he mumbled. "We need to go," Emma whispered quietly. "We are going to climb out the window." Lucas, still half asleep, nodded. Emma gently lifted Ella out of bed, cradling her in her arms. The little girl was too young to understand what was happening, but she sensed the fear in Emma's voice and stayed quiet. Emma hurried to the window, her heart racing. She could hear the intruder moving closer to the back door. Time was running out. With trembling hands, Emma unlocked the window and pushed it open. The cool night air rushed in, and for a brief moment, Emma felt a flicker of hope. They could make it. They could get out. She helped Lucas climb onto the windowsill. "Careful, Lucas," she whispered. "Slide down slowly." Lucas nodded, his small hands gripping the windowsill. As he carefully climbed out, Emma passed Ella down to him, making sure she was safe in her brother's arms before climbing out herself. The ground was only a few feet below, but it felt like a long drop. As Emma lowered herself down, her feet hit the cold grass, and for a moment everything was still. The night was quiet, and for the first time in what felt like hours, Emma could breathe. But they weren't safe yet. "We need to run to the neighbor's house," Emma whispered to the kids. "Stay close to me. Don't look back." Lucas nodded, clutching Ella's hand tightly. Together, they moved across the yard, the grass wet beneath their feet. Emma's heart pounded as they crept through the shadows, her eyes darting back to the house. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from inside. The intruder had found the back door. Emma's blood turned cold. She grabbed the children's hands and started running. They sprinted across the yard, their footsteps soft but hurried. Behind them, the back door slammed open with a violent crash. He was coming. Emma pushed herself to run faster, her legs burning with fear and adrenaline. The neighbor's house was just ahead, their porch light a small beacon of hope. In the dark, but the intruder's footsteps were getting closer, echoing through the still night. "Don't stop," Emma urged, her voice shaky. She could hear the kids panting beside her, their small legs struggling to keep up. The neighbor's front door was only a few steps away now. Emma reached out, pounding on the door with all her strength. "Help, please, help," she shouted, her voice breaking with desperation. The door opened, just as the intruder's footsteps came to a sudden stop. Emma and the children stumbled inside, as the neighbor, an older man named Mr. Thomas, quickly locked the door behind them. "What is going on?" Mr. Thomas asked, his voice filled with concern. "There is someone in the house," Emma panted, her words coming out in gasps. "He's after us." Mr. Thomas peered out the window, his face tense. "Stay here," he said, grabbing the phone to call the police. Emma hugged Lucas and Ella tightly, her body shaking with relief and fear. They were safe for now, but the image of the intruder outside still haunted her. She could still feel his presence, lurking somewhere in the dark. Then there was a knock at the door. Emma's heart stopped. Mr. Thomas raised the phone to his ear, but before he could speak, there was a voice from the other side of the door. "This is the police. We are here." Emma let out a shaky breath of relief. The police had arrived. Mr. Thomas opened the door cautiously, and two officers stepped inside, their faces serious but reassuring. "Are you all okay?" one of the officers asked. Emma nodded, still holding the children close. "He's in the house, the intruder. He's inside." The officers exchanged a glance before one of them spoke into his radio. "We will search the house," he said. "Stay here and keep the door locked." Emma watched as the officers left the house, heading toward the Nelson home. The fear that had gripped her for hours began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of safety. She knew it wasn't over yet, but for now, she and the children were safe. Time seemed to stretch as Emma waited in Mr. Thomas' living room, her heart still racing, but her body exhausted. Lucas and Ella sat beside her, their small faces pale and quiet. After what felt like an eternity, the police officers returned. Their faces were serious, but one of them gave Emma a slight nod, signaling that the immediate danger had passed. "We have searched the house," the officer said. "There is no one there now. It looks like the intruder fled through the back before we arrived." Emma let out a breath. She didn't realize she'd been holding. Relief washed over her, but fear still lingered at the edges of her mind. "Did you find out who it was?" she asked, her voice shaking. The officer hesitated. "We are not sure yet, but we will keep looking. For now, we are going to stay close by, and we have alerted the neighbors." "You did the right thing by getting the kids out." Emma nodded, grateful, but still on edge. "What about the phone calls?" she asked. "He kept calling me." He said he was inside the house. The officer's expression darkened. "We traced the calls. They were coming from inside the house. He must have been hiding upstairs the whole time, watching you." Emma's blood ran cold. The idea that the intruder had been so close, listening to her every move, sent a fresh wave of fear through her. She had been moments away from a nightmare worse than she could have imagined. The Nelsons returned shortly, After the police finished their investigation, they were horrified to learn what had happened while they were away, apologizing profusely to Emma and thanking her for protecting their children. Emma, still shaken, gathered her things and left the house with the officers escorting her. The night air was cool and the streets were silent, but it no longer felt like the comforting quiet of before. The world outside seemed darker now, filled with shadows and hidden dangers. As she drove home, Emma kept looking in her rearview mirror, half expecting to see the intruder's face staring back at her from the back seat. Her heart raced, but the road behind her remained empty. Still, the sense of unease clung to her like a shadow. She reached her house, unlocked every door and window before heading to her room. Even then, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house made her jump, and every shadow seemed to move. The memory of the calls, of the voice saying he was inside the house, echoed in her mind. The next morning, the police called Emma with an update. They had found signs of forced entry at the back door, and there were fingerprints, but so far, no match in the system. Whoever the intruder was, he had vanished without a trace. Emma tried to move on from the terrifying night, but the fear lingered. Days turned into weeks, and while she went back to her normal routine, the memory of that night never fully left her. One evening, just as she was beginning to feel like things might return to normal, Emma received a call on her cell phone. She hesitated, staring at the screen. It was an unknown number. Her stomach tightened with fear. With a deep breath, she answered. For a moment, there was silence on the other end. Then, a voice she would never forget spoke, cold and soft. "I'm still watching." The line went dead. Emma's heart sank. The nightmare wasn't over. He was still out there, waiting. From that day on, Emma never felt completely safe. Every creak of her house, every shadow in the corner of her vision, reminded her of the intruder who had slipped through the cracks of her world. The police couldn't find him, and neither could she. He remained a ghost in the background, a threat she couldn't shake. She changed her number, moved to a new apartment, and tried to live her life as if nothing had happened. But the memory of that night haunted her every day. The fear had become a part of her now, a permanent fixture. Emma often wondered who the man was, why he had chosen her, and why he kept calling. She never got the answers she needed, but one thing was certain: he was still out there, somewhere, and he wasn't done yet. The calls never came again, but the silence was worse. It meant he was waiting, planning, and in the back of Emma's mind, she knew that one day the phone would ring again, and when it did, she would have to face her worst nightmare once more. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Please share this video with your friends and family too. Thanks.